"You mean nothing to me," the Mafia boss said. By morning, he realized he had lost the only woman he ever loved. Dominic Salvatore was a man people feared before they even met him. In the part of the city where he ran things, his name alone could clear a room or fill it, depending on what he wanted. He owned restaurants, warehouses, a shipping company, and a dozen other businesses that looked normal on paper. Underneath all of it was a world most people never saw. A world of quiet threats, careful deals, and men who did what he said without asking why. He had grown up in that world. His father had built the foundation, and Dominic had spent his whole life learning how to protect it. By the time he was 35, he had already buried more people he loved than most men bury in a lifetime. Loss had taught him one lesson above all others: never let anyone get close enough to hurt you. He followed that rule the way other men follow their religion. People who worked for him respected him, but respect built on fear is a strange, fragile thing. It keeps men in line, but it does not keep them warm at night. Dominic had learned to live without warmth. He filled his days with meetings, numbers, and problems that needed solving, and he told himself that was enough. He had a big house with too many empty rooms, a closet full of expensive suits, and almost no one he could call simply to talk. Not about business, just to talk. His father had taught him that loneliness was the price of power, and for most of his life, Dominic had paid that price without complaint. Then he met Elena Marchetti, and the rules started to crack. She worked in a small flower shop 2 streets away from one of his restaurants. The shop was nothing special, just a narrow storefront with a bell over the door and buckets of flowers lined up along the window. Dominic passed it almost every day without noticing it. Then one afternoon, he needed flowers for his mother's grave, and he walked in without thinking twice. Elena was arranging a bunch of white lilies when he entered. She looked up, gave him a small, polite smile, and asked how she could help. She had no idea who he was. That, more than anything, was what caught his attention. Everyone in this part of the city knew who he was. Everyone treated him with careful respect, the kind that came from fear rather than warmth. Elena simply treated him like a customer. He remembered, years later, exactly what she had been wearing that first afternoon. A plain green apron dusted with pollen, her hair pulled back loosely, a smudge of dirt on one cheek from repotting something in the back room. She had asked him what the flowers were for, and when he told her, quietly, that they were for his mother's grave, her expression had softened in a way that felt entirely unguarded. She had not offered him the practiced sympathy of someone used to dealing with grieving strangers. She had simply told him that lilies were a fine choice, but that his mother might have liked something with more color too, something alive-looking rather than only formal. She put together a small bunch of yellow and white blooms without being asked, refusing to charge him extra for the change, and told him to come back and let her know if his mother would have approved. He had walked out of that shop unsettled in a way he could not explain, turning the conversation over in his mind for the rest of the day. He came back the next week, and the week after that, telling himself each time that he simply liked the shop. Elena began to recognize him, then to remember what he liked, then to save the freshest flowers for him without being asked. Slowly, without either of them planning it, conversation replaced small talk. She told him about her mother, who ran a small bakery across town. She told him about her dream of one day opening a bigger shop, one with a garden in the back where people could sit and enjoy the quiet. He told her almost nothing about his real life, only enough to keep the conversation going. It was months before she learned the truth about him, and by then, she had already fallen for the version of him she had gotten to know first. Quiet, thoughtful, a man who remembered small details and showed up on time. When she finally found out what he really did for a living, she was afraid, not of him exactly, but of what his world could mean for her own life. She thought about walking away. She almost did, but Dominic did something no one had ever seen him do before. He asked her to give him a chance to prove that the man she already knew was the real one, not the reputation that followed him through the streets. He did not beg. He was not the kind of man who begged for anything. He simply told her the truth, plainly, and let her decide. She stayed, but not without conditions of her own. She told him plainly that she would never ask about his business, and he was never to bring it near her shop, her home, or the life she was building. Dominic agreed without hesitation. It was the easiest promise he had ever made, because for the first time in years, he wanted a place in his life that had nothing to do with the empire he ran. Their first real date, months before any of that, had been almost embarrassingly ordinary. He had taken her to a small restaurant on the water, not one of his own, careful to choose neutral ground. He had shown up early, sat nervously at the table, and realized halfway through the evening that he had not felt nervous about anything in over a decade. Elena had laughed at something he said, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and the sound of it had stayed with him for days afterward. She had tested him too, in her own quiet way, long before she ever agreed to call him anything more than a friend. Once, early on, she asked him directly why a man who owned restaurants and warehouses always seemed to have bruised knuckles and tired eyes on Monday mornings. He could have lied easily. Lying was second nature to him by then. Instead, he told her, carefully and without details, that his work sometimes required things he was not proud of, and that he would rather lose her honestly than keep her with a lie. She had gone quiet for a long moment, studying his face, and then she had simply nodded and changed the subject. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something closer to respect, and Dominic had understood, even then, that this woman would never be won over by charm or money the way others in his life had been. Over the next 2 years, their relationship became the one steady, gentle thing in Dominic's otherwise hard life. He built her the garden she had always dreamed of, tucked behind her shop, with a small wooden bench where she liked to sit in the evenings after closing. He never brought his business into their home. He never let her see the darker parts of what he did. In front of her, he tried to be a different man, and slowly, that different man became more and more real. His men noticed the change too. Nico, his oldest friend and closest advisor, used to joke that Elena had done what no bullet or betrayal ever could. She had softened Dominic Salvatore. Not weakened him, Nico was careful to say, but softened him, the way sunlight softens hard ground just enough for something new to grow. There had been one moment, about a year into their relationship, when Elena caught a real glimpse of the danger that surrounded him. A rival organization, unhappy with territory Dominic controlled, had sent a warning one night in the form of a break-in at one of his warehouses, and for a frightening few hours, no one could reach Dominic by phone while he dealt with the situation. Elena had sat by her own phone the entire night, unable to sleep, imagining every terrible possibility, until he finally called just before dawn to tell her he was safe. She had cried with relief, and then, once the fear passed, she had asked him plainly whether nights like that would always be part of loving him. He had not lied to her. He told her yes, they might be, and that if she needed to walk away because of it, he would understand completely. She thought about it for days. In the end, she decided that loving him honestly, danger included, felt more true to her than a safer life without him ever could. It was a decision that made their bond stronger than it had been before, because from that point on, she was not with him out of naivety. She was with him with open eyes. Elena had her own small circle too, people who watched the relationship with a mixture of worry and hope. Her closest friend, Lucia, who worked at the bakery with Elena's mother, often teased her about falling for a man who looked like he belonged on the evening news. But even Lucia had to admit, after meeting Dominic a few times, that he treated Elena with a kind of careful attention most men never bothered to show. He remembered which flowers made her sneeze. He noticed when she was tired before she said a word about it. He never once raised his voice at her, not in 2 full years, which was more than Lucia could say about her own relationships. Elena's mother, Rosa, was harder to win over. She had lost her own husband young, to a life that had nothing to do with crime, but everything to do with hard work and bad luck, and she had raised Elena alone with a fierce protectiveness that never fully relaxed. She was polite to Dominic whenever he visited, but her eyes always carried a quiet warning, the kind only mothers seem able to give without saying a single word. Dominic understood that warning better than Rosa probably realized. He respected it, and he never tried to argue his way past it. He simply kept showing up, kept being steady, and slowly, over many small Sunday dinners, Rosa's guarded politeness began to soften into something closer to trust. But softness was dangerous in Dominic's world, and there were people who noticed it too, people who saw opportunity in it. One of those people was Vittorio Conte, a capo who had worked under Dominic's family for over a decade. Vittorio was ambitious in the way that quiet men often are, hiding his hunger for power behind a calm face and careful words. He had watched Dominic's rise with a mixture of respect and resentment, and he had grown tired of being second in a world he believed he deserved to lead. Vittorio had served the family since he was barely 20 years old, running small errands before working his way up through years of quiet loyalty. He had watched Dominic's father die and Dominic take over while still grieving, and he had told himself, at the time, that he was glad to serve a young leader he had helped raise. But years pass slowly when you are always one step behind, always the man giving advice, instead of the man making final decisions. Somewhere along the way, loyalty had curdled into something bitter, though Vittorio was skilled enough at hiding it that even Nico, who trusted almost no one completely, had never suspected him. The federal agents who approached Vittorio did not have to work very hard to convince him. They offered him what every unhappy second-in-command secretly wants: a way out that did not look like defeat, dressed up as protection instead of betrayal. He told himself he was simply being practical, that the walls were closing in on Dominic's organization regardless of what he did, and that a smart man made sure he was not standing underneath the building when it finally collapsed. He told himself Elena's involvement, once he thought of it, was simply good strategy, nothing personal. He almost believed that himself. For months, Vittorio had been meeting secretly with federal agents, feeding them small pieces of information in exchange for promises of protection and a lighter future for himself. He was careful, patient, and smart enough to know that if he was ever caught, he needed someone else to take the blame. He began planting the idea, in small conversations and careless comments, that perhaps the leak in the organization was closer to Dominic than anyone realized. Perhaps it was someone Dominic trusted completely, someone who had access to his home, his schedule, his private thoughts. Elena. It was a cruel and calculated seed to plant, and Vittorio knew exactly how to water it. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Elena had been seen talking to a stranger outside her shop, a man in a plain suit who did not belong in that part of the city. He mentioned that her shop's phone records showed calls to an unknown number around the same times that federal agents seemed to know things they should not have known. None of it was true. All of it was carefully arranged to look true. Dominic tried to ignore it at first. He told himself that Elena had nothing to do with his world, that she barely understood half of what he did, let alone the details someone would need to inform on him. But the federal pressure around him was growing heavier by the week. Agents were closing in on shipments, on meetings, on deals that only a small circle of people knew about. Someone was talking, and the fear of losing everything he had built made him question people he had never questioned before. The weeks leading up to that night had worn him down in ways he did not fully notice at the time. He was sleeping less, snapping at men who did not deserve it, pacing his office late into the night, going over lists of names, trying to find the shape of the leak. Elena noticed the change in him too, the tension in his shoulders, the way he sometimes stopped mid-sentence as though his mind had wandered somewhere dark. She asked him more than once if something was wrong, and each time he told her it was nothing, business as usual, nothing for her to worry about. He was trying to protect her from it, the same way he had always tried to keep his two worlds apart. He did not realize that the wall he had built to protect her was about to become the very thing that made her an easy target for suspicion, because she truly did know nothing, and knowing nothing looked, to a frightened man, exactly like hiding something. The night everything broke started like any other. Dominic came home late, his mind heavy with the news that another shipment had been intercepted, information that only a handful of people had access to. Elena was in the kitchen when he arrived, humming quietly to herself while she prepared dinner, completely unaware of the storm building inside him. He watched her for a moment from the doorway, and for a brief second, doubt and love wrestled inside him. Then Nico called with more details, Details that seemed to point, however faintly, toward her. A payment, a stranger, a pattern of timing that lined up too perfectly to ignore. Dominic's fear took over before his reason could catch up. He confronted her right there in the kitchen, his voice sharp and cold in a way she had never heard from him before. He asked her directly if she had been talking to anyone about his business. Elena, startled and confused, asked what he meant. Her honest confusion, to a calmer man, might have been proof enough of her innocence. But Dominic was not calm. He was a man cornered by fear, and fear does not listen well to reason. He accused her of betraying him. He listed the details Vittorio had planted, throwing them at her like accusations rather than questions. Elena tried to explain, tried to tell him she had no idea what he was talking about, that she loved him and would never do anything to hurt him. She reminded him of every promise she had kept, every late night she had never once complained about, every question about his business she had never once asked, exactly as he had wanted. But every word she said only seemed to make him angrier, because in his mind, denial was exactly what a guilty person would offer. She asked him, her voice starting to shake, why he would believe strangers and rumors over 2 years of her standing beside him without question. He had no good answer for that, and the lack of one only made him angrier at himself, which he turned, unfairly, into anger at her instead. It was easier, in that moment, to believe her guilty than to sit with the terrifying possibility that his entire world was collapsing and he had no one left to blame. It was in that kitchen, under the soft evening light, that Dominic said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He looked at the woman who had stood by him for 2 years, who had built a garden of quiet peace in the middle of his violent world, and he told her that she meant nothing to him, that she never had, that he had let her believe otherwise because it was convenient, and now that convenience was over. The words landed like a blow. Elena went completely still, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall in front of him. She did not argue anymore. She did not beg him to believe her. Something in his voice, something final and cruel, told her that no explanation would reach him that night. She simply nodded, once, and walked past him toward the bedroom. She packed only what mattered most: a few clothes, an old photograph of her mother, and the small wooden box where she kept letters Dominic had once written her, back when things were simple. She left the ring he had given her on the kitchen counter, not out of anger, but because it no longer felt like it belonged to her. Dominic did not stop her. He stood in the living room, arms crossed, jaw tight, telling himself he was doing the right thing, protecting what mattered most. He listened to her footsteps cross the hallway, heard the front door open and close, and told himself the silence that followed was relief. It was not relief. Within minutes, the house felt different, wrong in a way he could not quite name. He walked into the kitchen and saw the ring sitting on the counter exactly where she had left it, catching the light in a way that made his chest tighten painfully. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers, and thought about the evening he had given it to her, down on one knee in this very kitchen, nervous in a way he had never been before a business meeting in his life. He set it down again, unable to hold it for long, and sat at the table where they had shared hundreds of ordinary dinners, staring at the empty chair across from him. He told himself, over and over, that he had done what was necessary, that protecting his organization meant sometimes making hard choices, even painful ones. But the words rang hollow even inside his own head. He thought about her face when he had said those words to her, the way something behind her eyes had simply closed, like a door shutting quietly rather than slamming. He had seen men's faces change like that before, men who had given up on arguing for their own lives because they already knew the outcome. He had never expected to see that same look on Elena, and certainly never expected to be the one who put it there. It was the beginning of the worst night of his life. Elena walked 3 blocks before she allowed herself to cry. She sat down on a bus stop bench, her suitcase beside her, and let everything she had been holding back pour out of her in the dark. She thought about calling her mother, but it was late, and she did not want to worry her before she had time to think clearly. Instead, she simply sat there, letting the cold night air settle around her, trying to understand how 2 years of love could end in a single sentence. She eventually made her way to a small motel near the edge of town, the kind of place with flickering lights and a tired clerk who barely looked up when she checked in. She lay awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the argument over and over, searching for some version of it that made sense. She could not find one. The clerk at the front desk, an older woman with kind, tired eyes, had noticed Elena's red face and shaking hands when she checked in, and without asking any questions, had quietly handed her a cup of tea from the small pot behind the counter. It was a small kindness, the kind strangers sometimes offer without needing to know the whole story, and Elena found herself grateful for it in a way that almost made her cry all over again. She sat in her small room afterward, the tea going cold on the nightstand, staring at the box of old letters she had grabbed on her way out. She read through a few of them anyway, unable to stop herself. Letters Dominic had written her in the early months of their relationship, before either of them had grown fully comfortable trusting the other. In one, he had written that he did not deserve someone as honest as her, and that he hoped, one day, to become the kind of man who did. Reading his own words back to her now, after the night she had just survived, felt like a cruel joke. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box, telling herself she would decide what to do with all of it, once the sun came up and her mind was clearer. Sleep never fully came. She drifted in and out of restless half-dreams, her mind circling the same question again and again. How could 2 years of steady, careful love collapse so completely in the space of a single conversation? By the time gray morning light began creeping through the thin curtains, she had made her decision. She would take the early bus out of the city, stay with her aunt along the coast for a while, and give herself the distance she needed to think clearly, far from streets that reminded her of him at every corner. Back at the house, Dominic tried to bury himself in work, the way he always had whenever something threatened to break him. He called Nico, told him to gather more information on the supposed leak, to confirm what Vittorio had suggested once and for all. He wanted certainty. He wanted a reason to believe he had done the right thing. Nico arrived within the hour, his face unusually serious. He had spent the evening digging deeper into the details Vittorio had shared, cross-checking timelines, phone records, and payment trails. What he found did not point to Elena at all. It pointed somewhere much closer to home. Nico had always been careful, methodical in a way that made him useful for exactly this kind of work. He had learned, over years of loyal service, never to accept a story simply because it came from someone he trusted. He pulled surveillance logs from the street outside Elena's shop, cross-referenced delivery schedules, and called in a favor from a contact who worked communications for the organization, someone who could trace which numbers had actually been active during the times in question. It took hours of careful, unglamorous work, the kind no one ever saw or thanked him for, but by the middle of the night, the picture had become impossible to ignore. The stranger seen outside Elena's shop was not a federal agent meeting with her. He was a federal agent watching Vittorio's own contact, a low-level courier who had been making unusual visits to that same street. The phone calls that seemed to match the timing of leaked information were not Elena's at all, but calls placed from a burner phone registered to an address Vittorio had used before. Piece by piece, the story that had seemed so convincing began to fall apart, revealing the truth underneath it. It was Vittorio. It had been Vittorio for months, feeding information to federal agents while carefully steering suspicion toward the one person Dominic could not afford to lose. Nico laid it all out plainly, watching his old friend's face change from confusion to disbelief to something far worse, the dawning horror of what he had just done. Dominic sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across the table. He thought about Elena's face in the kitchen, the confusion in her eyes when he accused her, the way she had gone quiet instead of fighting back. She had not been hiding guilt. She had been absorbing a wound she never saw coming from the one person she trusted most. He thought about the words he had said. "You mean nothing to me. You never did." He had meant to protect himself. Instead, he had destroyed the one true thing in his life with his own hands. Dominic did not wait for morning. He left the house immediately, driving through empty streets with a kind of urgency he had not felt in years. He went to her shop first, though he knew, even before he arrived, that it would be closed and dark. He went to her mother's house next, knocking gently despite the late hour, hoping Elena had gone there instead. The drive to Rosa's house felt endless, though it took only 15 minutes. Dominic found himself gripping the steering wheel tightly, replaying the argument in his mind, hating every word he had said, wishing desperately for the chance to take even one of them back. He passed the flower shop's dark window and felt something twist painfully in his chest, thinking of all the ordinary afternoons he had walked past that very window years ago, before he knew how much it would come to mean to him. Her mother, Rosa, answered the door in her robe, clearly startled to see him standing there so late. She had never fully trusted Dominic, not because of anything specific he had done, but because mothers often sense danger before their daughters do. When she saw the desperation on his face, though, something in her expression softened slightly, enough to tell him that Elena was not there, but that she had called earlier, sounding upset, mentioning something about an early bus out of the city. Dominic thanked her and turned to leave, but Rosa stopped him at the door. She told him, quietly but firmly, that whatever he had done, he needed to fix it properly this time, not with money or gifts, but with honesty. She told him that her daughter did not need a man who protected her from the world, only to hurt her worse than the world ever could. Dominic nodded, accepting the words without argument, and went back out into the night. He checked 2 bus stations before finding the right one, a small terminal on the edge of the city where early morning buses left for towns along the coast. The building was mostly empty at that hour, lit by flickering fluorescent lights, the kind of place that always felt slightly sad no matter the time of day. At the first station, an employee mopping the floor told him no bus toward the coast would leave for another 2 hours, and Dominic realized, with a jolt of panic, that he might be looking in the wrong place entirely. He called Nico from the car, asking him to check every terminal schedule in the city for early departures heading toward the coast, and Nico, without hesitation or complaint despite the hour, pulled up route after route until he found one small station on the edge of town with a 6 o'clock departure that matched what Rosa had described. He found Elena sitting alone near the far end of the waiting area, her suitcase resting against her legs, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in her coat, her face pale from a sleepless night. When she saw him walking toward her, she did not run, and she did not soften either. She simply watched him approach with a tired, guarded expression that hurt him more than any anger could have. Dominic sat down beside her without asking permission, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The station's ancient clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking the minutes until her bus arrived. He started slowly, telling her everything, about Vittorio, about the false trail of evidence, about the fear that had clouded his judgment and turned him into someone he barely recognized. He told her that none of it excused what he had said to her, that no threat to his business justified the cruelty of his words. He told her that the moment he learned the truth, he understood exactly what he had thrown away. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tired. She told him that she understood fear could make people say things they did not mean, but understanding was not the same as forgiving. She told him that the words he had said in that kitchen were not just angry words, they had been aimed precisely, cutting exactly where they knew they would hurt most. She told him that trust, once broken that way, could not simply be rebuilt with an apology, however honest it was. She asked him, quietly, whether he had even paused, for one single second, before saying those words to her, or whether fear had simply taken over completely, with no room left for the 2 years they had built together. Dominic thought about the question seriously before answering, because she deserved an honest answer, not a comforting one. He admitted that in the moment, fear had taken over so completely that he had barely recognized himself. He told her that was not an excuse, only an explanation, and that he understood if it was not enough. Elena nodded slowly, not in agreement exactly, but in acknowledgement that he had at least told her the truth, instead of something easier to hear. She told him she needed to know that the man who loved her would never again let fear speak for him, not toward her, not in anger, not ever again. Dominic promised her that, and for the first time that morning, his voice did not sound like the voice of a man trying to win an argument. It sounded like a man simply telling the truth. Dominic did not argue with her. He did not try to convince her that one conversation could undo what one night had broken. Instead, he simply told her the truth of what she meant to him, plainly, and without the armor he usually wore. He told her that in a life built on control and calculation, she had been the only thing he had never had to calculate. That loving her had been the one honest, unguarded choice he had ever made, and that losing her had shown him, in the space of a single terrible night, exactly how empty his empire would feel without her in it. He did not ask her to come back to him. He told her he understood if she needed time, distance, or even if she decided she never wanted to see him again. He simply asked for one thing, the chance to prove, slowly and patiently, that the man who loved her was more real than the man who had hurt her. The station speaker crackled, announcing that her bus would arrive in 10 minutes. Elena glanced toward the platform, then back at Dominic, her eyes glassy, but no longer distant. She told him she needed time to think, that nothing between them could go back to how it was before, not right away, and maybe not ever completely. But when he asked, quietly, if he could at least drive her somewhere safe instead of letting her get on a bus alone before sunrise, she hesitated only a moment before nodding. They stood together, and Elena picked up her suitcase before Dominic could reach for it, a small but clear signal that she was not ready to lean on him the way she once had. They walked out of the station in silence, the first light of morning beginning to soften the dark sky above the city. In the days that followed, Dominic kept his word. He did not push her to return to the life they had shared before. He gave her space when she needed it, showed up when she allowed him to, and slowly began rebuilding trust through small, consistent actions rather than grand gestures. He dealt with Vittorio through proper channels within his organization, removing him from any position of power without the kind of violence that might once have followed such a betrayal. He wanted, for the first time in his life, to prove that strength did not have to come from destruction. Dealing with Vittorio quietly, without bloodshed, was harder than it sounded. Men within the organization expected a harsh response to betrayal, and some grumbled that Dominic was going soft, the very thing his enemies had always hoped for. But Dominic held firm. He stripped Vittorio of his position, his territory, and his standing among the other capos, making it clear through every channel that mattered that betrayal would never again be rewarded with power. It was not mercy exactly. It was Dominic choosing, deliberately, to become a different kind of leader than the one fear had almost turned him into that night in the kitchen. Nico worried, at first, that showing restraint would make Dominic look weak to rivals watching from outside, the kind of weakness that invited challenge. But in the months that followed, the opposite proved true. Word spread quietly through the city that Dominic Salvatore had uncovered a traitor in his own inner circle and handled it with control rather than chaos. Without a single headline, without a single funeral. Men who had once respected him, only out of fear, began to respect him for something steadier, a kind of quiet discipline that made his organization feel more solid, not less. Vittorio disappeared from the city entirely within a few months, taking whatever remained of his pride with him, and no one in Dominic's circle ever spoke his name again, except as a quiet warning to new recruits about where unchecked ambition eventually leads. Elena, for her part, did not rush back into his arms. She moved in with her mother for a while, taking time to breathe, to think, to remember who she was outside of the relationship that had defined so much of her life for 2 years. She kept working at her shop, tending to the garden Dominic had built for her, finding comfort in the quiet routine of flowers and soil and sunlight. During those weeks, Elena spent long evenings sitting alone in the garden, asking herself hard questions she had avoided during the 2 easier years before that terrible night. She asked herself whether she had built her entire sense of safety around a man whose world could turn violent and uncertain overnight, and whether that had been wise or simply blind. She talked through some of it with Lucia, who listened without judgment, and some of it with her mother, who offered fewer opinions than usual, sensing that Elena needed to arrive at her own conclusions rather than be handed someone else's. Slowly, Elena came to understand that her anger was not really about whether Dominic's world was dangerous. She had known that from the beginning and chosen it anyway, with open eyes, exactly as she had promised herself she would after that frightening night when his warehouse had been attacked. Her anger was about the fact that fear had turned him, even briefly, into someone willing to throw away everything true between them without pausing to ask a single honest question first. That was the piece she needed him to understand and change, not the danger itself, which she had already made her peace with long ago. Weeks turned into months. Dominic visited the shop sometimes, never demanding anything, simply showing up the way he had in the very beginning, before either of them knew where things would lead. He brought no expectations, only patience. Slowly, carefully, something between them began to shift again. Not back to what it had been, but towards something new, something built more honestly than before. There were setbacks along the way. One evening, a few weeks into their slow rebuilding, Elena grew quiet and distant after Dominic mentioned, without thinking, a delay caused by federal attention on one of his warehouses. The mention of anything connected to that world was enough to bring the memory of that night rushing back for her, and she asked him, gently but firmly, to leave early that evening. Dominic did not argue or try to talk her out of her feelings. He simply apologized, told her he understood, and left, calling the next day only to check that she was all right, not to push for anything more. It was a small moment, easy to overlook, but it mattered enormously to both of them. It proved that Dominic had truly changed the way he responded to tension between them, choosing patience over the old instinct to demand and control. Lucia noticed the change too, teasing Elena gently one afternoon at the bakery that the Mafia boss she used to worry about now looked more like a nervous schoolboy waiting outside the shop for permission to come in. Even Rosa, still cautious by nature, began greeting Dominic with something closer to warmth during his visits, occasionally sending him home with a container of pastries, a small gesture that meant more to him than she probably realized. One evening, months after that terrible night at the bus station, Elena found Dominic sitting on the wooden bench in the garden behind her shop, the same bench where she had once spent quiet evenings imagining a future she thought she had lost. He did not say much when she joined him. He simply sat beside her, watching the last light of day fade behind the buildings, content, for once, with silence instead of certainty. Elena eventually broke that silence herself. She told him she was not ready to promise forever, not yet, but she was ready to try again, slowly, honestly, without the walls either of them had built before. Dominic did not respond with grand words or promises he could not fully guarantee. He simply reached over and took her hand, the way he had the very first time, back when she had no idea who he truly was, and he had no idea how much he would come to need her. It was not a perfect ending, and both of them knew it. Trust, once broken so sharply, leaves a mark that never fully disappears. But sitting there in the quiet garden, hands loosely joined, they understood something they had both nearly lost forever, that real love is not proven by the words spoken in anger, but by the choice to keep showing up, patiently and honestly, long after the worst night has passed. A year later, almost to the day since that terrible night in the kitchen, Dominic walked into Elena's shop the same way he had the very first time, though everything about him felt different now. He was no longer the guarded, closed-off man who had wandered in looking for flowers for his mother's grave, unable to imagine that a florist's daughter would change the entire direction of his life. He carried with him, this time, not a business card or a careless excuse to return, but a small velvet box, the same ring restored and cleaned, resting exactly where it had once caught the kitchen light on the night everything nearly ended. He did not get down on one knee immediately. He waited until closing time, until the last customer had left, and Elena was sweeping stray petals from the floor, humming quietly the way she always did when her mind was at ease. He told her, simply, that he did not want to promise her a perfect life, because he knew now that no such thing existed, especially not for a man like him. What he could promise was that he would never again let fear speak louder than love, that he would spend every day proving, in small and steady ways, that she meant everything to him, not nothing, and never had. Elena looked at him for a long moment, flowers still in her hands, and thought about how far they had both come since that terrible morning at the bus station. She thought about her mother's warning, about Lucia's teasing, about the garden Dominic had built for her before either of them understood how much they would need it later. She set the flowers down slowly, walked toward him, and told him yes, not because the danger in his world had disappeared, but because she finally trusted that he would never again let that danger speak for him where she was concerned. Word of the engagement spread quietly through both of their worlds. Nico, never one for sentimental speeches, simply told Dominic that Elena's mother made better pastries than any bakery in the city, and that he had better not do anything foolish enough to lose access to them a second time. Rosa cried at the news, though she would later insist to anyone who asked that it was only because of the wedding planning stress, never quite admitting how relieved and happy she truly was to see her daughter settled with a man who had finally learned to put her first. Dominic Salvatore had spent his whole life believing that power meant control, that strength meant never letting anyone close enough to hurt him. It took losing Elena, even for one night, to teach him the truth, that the only power worth having was the courage to be honest, even when honesty meant admitting how deeply he had failed the person he loved most. And in that quiet garden, months before the ring found its way back into the light, as the stars began to appear above the city he once ruled, through fear alone, he finally understood what real strength looked like. It looked like sitting beside the woman he loved, holding her hand, and simply staying, patiently, for as long as it took to earn back what one careless night had almost cost him forever. Their story never made the evening news, and it never appeared in any official record of the city's quiet, dangerous underworld. But for the two people who lived it, it remained the truest lesson either of them ever learned, that the words spoken in fear can nearly destroy a lifetime of love, but they do not have to be the final word, not if two people are willing to sit together in the wreckage, tell the truth, and slowly, patiently, build something honest out of what remains.